The secrets of Pelican Bay, America's hidden hellhole. The alarms were already screaming when Officer Daniels froze in front of cell 117. Inside that small concrete box, something impossible was happening, something Pelican Bay was never supposed to allow. The inmate inside, a quiet man named Raymond Cole, was standing in the middle of his cell, holding a piece of metal that should not exist in the security housing unit. The SHU, Pelican Bay's most feared place, was built to make escape impossible. No tools, no loose screws, no weak points. But in Raymond's hand was a long silver shard, carved perfectly from the inside of the cell itself. And on the floor behind him was something even worse, a hole. A real hole. A crack in the wall wide enough for a hand to slip through. A crack that wasn't there yesterday. Daniel's voice shook as he called for backup, the sound echoing down the long, silent hallway. Raymond didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at the officer with a look that said, "Pelican Bay isn't what you think it is." Before the responding officers could arrive, Raymond slowly pressed the metal shard against the wall, twisted it, and a hidden panel of concrete shifted again, revealing a dark space behind it. A space no one knew about. A space no inmate should ever be able to reach. And just as Raymond leaned toward that darkness, the screen cuts to black. Now, let's go back to where this secret really began. Hours earlier, before alarms, before fear, before anyone knew Pelican Bay had a hidden weakness, Raymond Cole woke up in his cell like any other day. He had been here for years. The SHU was designed to break men slowly, 23 hours alone, 1 hour in a small yard with walls too high to see the sky, lights that never fully turn off, silence that feels heavy enough to crush thoughts. But this morning something felt wrong. For the first time, Raymond heard a sound inside his cell that did not belong there. A faint tapping. Tap, tap, tap. At first he thought it came from the vents. Or maybe from plumbing. Pelican Bay was old. Machines groan sometimes. But then it happened again, closer this time. Tap, tap, tap. Raymond pressed his ear to the wall and held his breath. Someone, or something, was tapping back. He waited. Another tap came. Slow, steady. Like a code. He didn't know what it meant, but it woke something in him, curiosity, hope, danger, all mixed into one. For weeks, Raymond had noticed tiny bits of dust on his floor. Pale gray grains. He thought it was from old paint or cracks in the ceiling. But now he realized they were coming from the wall itself. Something behind that wall was shifting. He didn't tell officers. He didn't report it. Because in Pelican Bay, secrets were currency. And this one felt big. Raymond began scraping gently at the paint with his fingernail. The wall sounded hollow. That didn't make sense. SHU walls were supposed to be solid. No empty spaces. No hidden rooms. Everything was built like a bunker. But this wall sounded wrong. Raymond stopped. He knew he needed something sharper. Something thin. Something he could hide easily. So over the next few days he filed down a piece of metal from the edge of his bunk. It was risky. Dangerous. Completely forbidden. Getting caught meant losing the little privileges he had. But the tapping never stopped. It got louder. More frequent. Almost like it was calling him. One night, during the quietest hour, when the halls were empty and the air felt frozen, Raymond slid the metal piece into a tiny crack he found behind a bolt in the wall. He twisted. The wall made a sound like a breath. A faint shift. A tiny vibration. Raymond froze, heart pounding. He twisted again. A thin line in the concrete opened. Just for a second, like the wall was pretending to be solid but wasn't. Raymond backed up, shocked. The next morning, something even stranger happened. The tapping stopped. It didn't return all day. And for the first time, Raymond felt fear. Real fear. Because whatever was happening behind that wall had noticed him. That night, as the lights dimmed and the building settled into its usual silence, Raymond stood up. He couldn't wait anymore. He had to know the truth. He placed the metal shard into the crack, pushed, and the concrete slid open wider than before. Behind it was darkness. Cold. Silent. Raymond leaned closer. And right then, a loud boom shook the entire hallway. His cell door rattled. Emergency lights began flashing. Someone, somewhere had triggered an alarm. Raymond had only seconds to choose. Step into the darkness, or step back before the officers arrived. He raised the metal shard. He stepped toward the hidden space. And the chapter ends right here. Because what happened the moment those officers reached his cell will change everything. When the officers stormed into the hallway, the flashing red lights made everything look unreal, like Pelican Bay had suddenly turned into a scene from a movie. But inside cell 117 nothing was dramatic. Nothing was loud. Nothing was violent. Raymond Cole simply stood there, halfway between two worlds. One world was the SHU with its cold floors and brighter-than-necessary lights. The other world was the dark hidden space behind the wall, so black it swallowed the light around it. Officer Daniels was the first to reach the door. He froze. He'd seen riots. He'd seen standoffs. He'd even seen a few inmates try to hurt themselves just to get out of the SHU for a minute. But he had never seen an inmate standing in front of a moving wall. For a moment, neither man spoke. Raymond just stared at Daniels with that same sharp, quiet focus, the kind of look a person gives when they've discovered a secret too big for words. Behind Daniels, two more officers arrived, Officer Riley and Officer Hart. They whispered to each other, confused because from where they stood, the wall looked normal. Daniels stepped forward. "Raymond," he said carefully, "put the metal down." Raymond didn't move. Daniels repeated it, louder this time. "I said drop it." Raymond slowly looked down at the metal shard. He didn't raise it. He didn't threaten anybody. He just held it like someone who'd found the only key out of a nightmare. But then something happened that changed the officer's confusion into fear. The wall behind Raymond shifted, on its own. Not because he touched it. Not because he moved. Not because anything forced it. It simply slid back into place with a quiet, smooth click. The hidden space disappeared. The crack sealed. The wall became perfect concrete again. Riley stepped back so fast he bumped into Hart. Daniels blinked twice, unsure if what he saw was real or some kind of trick of the lights. Raymond stepped away from the wall and placed the metal shard on the floor, quietly, like he wasn't surrendering, just obeying the rules of the moment. He lifted his hands slowly. The officers cuffed him. Standard procedure. But none of them took their eyes off the wall. They weren't afraid of Raymond. They were afraid of whatever was behind that wall. As they led Raymond out of his cell, he whispered something. But it was so soft only Daniels heard it. "It opens from the inside." Daniels stopped walking. "What did you say?" Raymond didn't repeat it. He didn't look back. He just let the officers guide him down the hallway. Behind them, cell 117 looked normal. Plain. Solid. But Daniels knew what he saw. He knew what moved. And he knew Pelican Bay was not supposed to have anything that opens from the inside. Still, there was protocol. Raymond was taken to a holding room for questioning. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He just sat quietly, calm in a way that made Riley nervous. While the officers prepared paperwork, Raymond stared at the wall in the room the same way he had stared at the wall in his cell, as if any wall in Pelican Bay might shift at any second. Hours passed. The officers searched Raymond's cell from top to bottom. They scanned it, measured it, knocked on every inch of concrete. They looked for hidden hinges, cracks, pressure plates, weird textures, anything. They found nothing. No crack. No hole. No dust. No loose bolts. No sign a wall had ever moved. It was perfect. Too perfect. Hart said, "Maybe he hallucinated it." Riley said, "Then how did we all hallucinate it too?" Daniels didn't say anything. He just stared at the photos of the cell on the table. He didn't trust the building anymore. When they went back to the holding room to question Raymond, he didn't look scared. He looked relieved. Daniels sat down across from him. "Tell me what's behind that wall." Raymond lifted his head slowly. "There's a hallway back there. A very old one." Daniels swallowed. "Why would there be a hallway inside a concrete wall?" Raymond leaned closer. "Because Pelican Bay is older than you think." Daniels stared at him. "What does that mean?" Raymond took a deep breath. "It means the prison was built on top of something else." Before Daniels could ask another question, something shook the entire building. Just once, just enough to make the lights flicker and the officers glance up. A deep rumble. Like something heavy moving far below them. Like something alive. Raymond looked at Daniels. "That's it," he whispered. "That's what's behind the wall." And that's where this chapter ends. Because the moment they discover what's causing those rumbles, the real secret of Pelican Bay begins. The rumble faded, but the room didn't feel normal afterward. It felt heavier, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Officer Daniels stood up slowly, eyes fixed on the ceiling even though he knew the sound didn't come from above. It came from under them. Raymond wasn't shaking. He wasn't panicking. He was the calmest person in the room. And that scared Daniels more than the rumble itself. He turned back to Raymond. "What is under this prison?" Raymond's voice was quiet, steady. "Not what. Who?" Officer Riley stepped forward. "Look, enough with the games. You're messing with your own safety right now." Raymond looked at Riley like the officer was a child who didn't understand the rules of a dangerous game. "It started months ago. The tapping. The dust on my floor. The cold air coming from a wall that should be solid. Daniels frowned. Cold air. Raymond nodded. Something is moving back there. Something alive. Silence hit the room like a punch. Riley let out a forced laugh. Come on. This is the SHU. Nothing moves except officers and inmates. Raymond slowly lifted his cuffed hands, just enough to show he wasn't trying to resist. Then why did your wall breathe? Daniel's skin tightened. Because he saw the wall shift. He wasn't imagining it. He sat back down. Tell me everything. From the beginning. Raymond took a long breath. There's a place under Pelican Bay, older than the prison. Before they built the SHU, before this land was even cleared, they dug tunnels. Hart raised an eyebrow. For what? Raymond leaned forward. To hide people. The room went cold. Raymond continued, his voice low and steady, like he'd been waiting months to finally say this. Not inmates. Not officers. Workers. People who built the prison. They never left. Daniel shook his head. That makes no sense. Raymond didn't argue. He just stared at the wall behind Daniels, the same way he had stared at his cell wall. You don't have to believe me, he whispered. You only have to listen. He told them about the nights when the tapping turned into scraping. He told them how the air sometimes came through the wall smelling like dirt, wet dirt, like you smell in old basements. He told them about the time he thought he heard someone breathing behind the wall. Not loud. Not fast. Just slow, steady, human. Riley stepped back. Hart stopped taking notes. Daniels didn't move. If there's something underground, Daniels said, why didn't anyone report it before? Raymond shook his head slowly. They did. That sentence made Riley's stomach drop. What do you mean? They did? Raymond's eyes darkened. The men who reported it disappeared. Daniel stiffened. Transferred. No, Raymond shook his head. Gone. Riley whispered, gone where? Raymond looked straight at Daniels. Inside the walls. Silence. Thick, cold, real. Daniels stepped away for a moment to think, because this story was turning into something he couldn't explain. Something he didn't want to believe. But then something unexpected happened. A knock came from the door. Not a normal knock. 3 slow hits. Heavy. Echoing down the hallway. All the officers turned toward the door. No one else was supposed to be on this floor. They hadn't called anyone. No shift change. No supervisors. No medical staff. Hart walked to the door and opened it, but the hallway was empty. No footsteps. No shadow. No sign anyone had just been there. Daniel stepped into the hall looking both ways. Empty. But then he saw it. On the floor, right in front of the door, a line of gray dust. The same dust Raymond found in his cell. Daniel's heartbeat kicked harder. He looked back into the room and whispered. It followed him. Raymond didn't smile. He didn't look proud. He just whispered. It knows I told you. Before Daniels could respond, the lights flickered again. A second rumble shook the hallway, sharper than the first. This time it wasn't a vibration. It was footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Coming from beneath the floor. Daniels grabbed his radio. Control, we need backup on SHU level 1 now. Static. No response. Hart tried his radio. Also dead. Riley pulled out his baton with shaking hands. Raymond leaned back in his chair. It's coming up, he whispered. And right then, before they could react, one of the floor tiles in the hallway slid a 1/4 inch sideways. Just a tiny movement. But enough. Enough to let them know something under Pelican Bay was trying to come out. Officer Riley froze as the floor tile shifted. Just that tiny, quiet scrape of concrete moving against concrete. A sound no one in Pelican Bay ever expected to hear. Daniel stepped backward into the room, blocking the door with his body. Hart, lock it. Now. Hart slammed the steel door shut and slid the heavy bolt across. But everyone in that room knew something terrifying. Pelican Bay's doors were designed to keep inmates in, not to keep something else out. The room went silent. Raymond lifted his head, staring at the floor, like he could see through it. It didn't used to come this high, he said softly. Not until the new cracks started forming. Riley swallowed hard. What is it? A person? An animal? Raymond shook his head slowly. It used to be people. The officers looked at each other, confused and scared at the same time. What does that mean? Daniels asked. Raymond's voice stayed calm. They were workers. Tunnel diggers. They were never supposed to stay down there. But one day something went wrong. A collapse. A gas leak. A seal. Nobody knows the full story. He leaned closer. But they didn't die. Hart's face tightened. How can you know that? Raymond nodded toward the tiled floor beneath their feet. Because they're still moving. A sudden boom shook the room again, this time loud enough that dust fell from the ceiling. Riley jumped. What was that? Raymond didn't flinch. It's the same sound I've been hearing for months. Daniels felt his heart hammering in his chest. This was no longer inmate behavior or mental illness. This was structural. This was physical. This was real. He moved closer to the door and pressed his ear to it, carefully, slowly. For a second he heard nothing. Then, tap, 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 from the hallway. Right. Outside. The door. Daniel stumbled back. No. That's impossible. The floor under the doorframe gave a soft groan, like weight was being pressed against it. Raymond whispered. It followed the dust trail. Hart's voice shook. We need to call for help. Daniels lifted his radio to try again. Control, this is Daniels, SHU Level 1, we have a serious situation. Respond. Static. He repeated it. More static. Then. A faint voice crackled through, but it wasn't Control. It was whispering. Breathy. Slow. Inhuman. No words. Just breathing into the radio. Daniels dropped it. The radio hit the floor and rolled under the table. Riley pointed toward the door with trembling hands. The floor, look. Another tile shifted upward. Not all the way. Just enough to lift at the corner. Like fingers, pushing. Daniel stepped back. What do we do if it breaks through? Raymond lowered his voice. You won't see it coming through the door. The officers snapped their heads toward him. What do you mean? It's pushing the tiles. Raymond shook his head. It doesn't use doors. Silence filled the room. Hart swallowed. Then how did it follow us to this room? Raymond looked at the wall behind him. The same way it moved behind my cell. Daniels turned slowly toward the wall. The same wall they'd written off as solid. And his stomach dropped. Because at eye level, in the plain gray concrete, a thin line was forming. Crack. Fresh. Growing. Silent and slow like a mouth opening. Daniel stepped back. No. Riley shouted, get away from the wall. Hart grabbed his baton and pointed it toward the crack even though it was useless. Raymond whispered. I told you. It opens from the inside. The crack split wider. Concrete dust drifted down like ashes. A cold gust of air poured into the room, air that did not come from any vent. A low scraping came from behind the wall. Something was moving toward them. Something with weight. Something with intention. Daniels backed into the center of the room. Everyone get behind the table, now. The officers pulled Raymond's chair back, forming a small barrier, weak but better than nothing. The wall cracked open another inch. And another. And another. The scraping grew louder. Hart whispered, it's coming through. A shape shifted behind the wall. A shadow. Tall. Thin. Wrong. Riley's voice cracked. What is that? Raymond didn't blink. That, he said, is one of the builders. And right as the wall split wide enough for a hand, a pale, skeletal finger slid out, coated in wet dirt. The room erupted in screams. And the chapter ends right there. The pale finger curled against the edge of the cracked wall, slow, stiff, like it hadn't moved in years. Officer Riley stumbled backward so hard he hit the metal table, sending a loud clang through the room. Daniel's breath froze in his chest. He had seen dangerous inmates. He had seen riots. But he had never seen a human hand come through a wall that was supposed to be solid concrete. Hart whispered, voice trembling, that's not possible. Nobody could survive in there. Raymond kept his eyes locked on the wall. They didn't survive the way you think. The scraping behind the wall grew louder, closer. The crack widened another inch and now they could see more. A wrist. Thin. Gray. Covered in dried dirt. And behind it, movement. Something was trying to pull itself into the room. Riley raised his baton, but his hands were shaking so badly the metal rattled. Daniels took a step forward, not to be brave but because he knew if he froze, everyone else would follow. Raymond, he whispered, tell me what that thing wants. Raymond turned his head slowly. They want out. Another finger pushed through the crack. Then another. A whole hand now gripped the concrete, pulling. The muscles, or what was left of them, twitched under the skin. Hart's knees buckled. That's not a person anymore. Raymond gave a small, sad nod. They were trapped for decades. No sunlight. No food. No air except what seeped through the tunnels. They'd changed. They became something else. The officers backed away from the wall as the arm pushed farther through. The bone was visible through the skin. The nails looked cracked and sharp. Then, a face appeared in the crack. Not fully. Not enough to see its features. Just one eye. What? Colorless. Like something that had forgotten how to blink. Riley dropped his baton and yelled, "Get out of the way!" But Daniels grabbed his arm. No sudden moves. Hart's voice shook. Why not? Because we don't know what it reacts to. The eye blinked once, slowly, like the movement was painful. Then something happened that froze the room. The creature whispered. A rough, broken sound forced through dry vocal cords. It just help? Daniel's heart dropped. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't reaching for them. It was reaching out. Raymond whispered. I told you, they were workers. Riley shook his head wildly. I'm calling for emergency response, now. But when he grabbed his radio, the same heavy breathing returned. Then a deep, scraping voice whispered through the static. Don't? Riley threw the radio across the room. The creature at the wall pushed harder. Concrete cracked, popped, fell away in small chunks. Its shoulder forced halfway through now. And behind it, they heard more. More scraping. More movement. More voices trying to breathe after decades in the dark. Daniel's voice finally broke. How many are there? Raymond closed his eyes. All of them. The officers formed a line, but fear shook every muscle in their bodies. The wall continued to split, larger now, wide enough for part of a head to squeeze through. A pale forehead. Dirty hair. Hollow cheeks. The smell of earth filled the room. Daniels grabbed Raymond's arm. What do they want from you? Raymond looked at him with a strange sadness. They know I found the opening. They think I can help them. The creature whispered again, quiet, desperate, almost childlike. Lethii, JHT. Raymond whispered back. They want to see the sun. For a moment, just a moment, the officers almost pitied it. But then another arm reached through the wall. Then a third. Then a fourth. Riley screamed, it's not just one. They're coming from everywhere. The crack burst wider, chunks of concrete blasting onto the floor. Daniels grabbed the table. Barricade the wall. Now. Hart and Riley pushed the metal table against the crack, but the arms kept pushing through gaps, scraping, clawing, reaching blindly. Raymond stood still and quiet. Too quiet. Daniels yelled at him, help us push it. But Raymond didn't move. He just stared at the wall, his eyes wide with realization. They're not trying to get in, he whispered. The officers turned to him. What? Raymond pointed at the crack. They're trying to open it wider, from the other side. The officers froze. Because if these creatures were opening something from behind the wall, then there was a passage, a tunnel, an entire hidden world under Pelican Bay. And it was waking up. The table shook as the hands pushed harder, lifting the metal off the floor inch by inch. The officers held tight, but it wasn't enough. Daniel shouted, voice cracking. We can't hold this. And then, the table rose another inch. Arms slipped underneath. Fingers curled around the edges. Riley screamed. Daniels braced. Hart cried out. The creatures pulled. And the chapter ends right there. The table lifted off the ground as if invisible hands were raising it from below. Daniels, Riley, and Hart pressed down with all their strength, but the creatures beneath the metal were stronger, slow, shaking, but impossibly strong after decades of clawing through tunnels no human should survive. Raymond stood in the corner, frozen. Not with fear, but with understanding. Daniel shouted, Raymond, help us push this thing back. But Raymond whispered something instead. Something the officers could barely hear over the scraping and groaning metal. They're not trying to hurt you. The table lifted another inch. Riley yelled, are you seeing this? They're climbing through the wall. Raymond shook his head slowly. No, they're trying to get past you. With a sudden jerk, like a surge of strength from below, the table tipped forward and slammed onto its side. The officers fell back. Arms, 6, 8, maybe more, slid out from the crack in the wall, followed by shoulders pale and trembling, covered in dust and dirt from decades underground. A head pushed through next, hair hanging in strings. Skin stretched thin. Eyes blinking painfully at the dim lights. Daniels raised his hands trying to protect himself. Stay back. Don't come any closer. But the creature didn't reach for him. It reached upward. Up toward the ceiling. Up toward the light. Raymond stepped forward slowly, ignoring the officers' shocked breaths. They're not monsters. They're desperate. One of the creatures turned toward Raymond, blinking, as if it recognized him. Raymond whispered, you heard me through the wall, and you followed the sound. That's why the tapping started. Another creature squeezed out, skin gray from lack of sunlight, fingers trembling as they touched the floor like it was new territory. One of them whispered, voice rough and broken. Lethia, JHT. The officers lowered their weapons a little. Just a little. Daniel's voice cracked. They're trying to get out of the prison? Raymond nodded. They've been trapped under Pelican Bay for decades. They want sunlight. They want air. Hart stepped closer, whispering, why didn't they come sooner? Raymond looked at him with sad eyes. Because the tunnels were sealed. Only now, after years of pressure, years of scraping, the walls finally started giving way. More creatures crawled through. Some walked hunched. Others dragged themselves. None attacked. They all moved toward the door. Riley whispered, they're escaping, and they're not even looking at us. Daniels lowered his baton. This isn't a security breach. It's a rescue. The creatures moved down the hallway, slow, confused, but determined. Their pale skin twitched at every flicker of light, every open space, every breath of air. Raymond walked behind them as if guiding a lost group of ghosts. When one stumbled, Raymond caught its arm gently, helping it stand. Daniels watched, stunned. You're helping them? Raymond nodded. They tapped for months. They were asking for help. No one listened. The officers followed cautiously down the hallway, watching as the creatures moved toward the stairwell, the path leading up to the yard. A place where sunlight would finally reach their skin. As they climbed, Daniels realized something shocking. Even after decades underground, even after living through darkness, silence, and walls that crushed everything human, they still had hope. They still wanted to rise. When they reached the yard door, Daniels swiped his keycard. His hand shook. Riley whispered, are we really doing this? Daniels swallowed hard. I'm not going to be the one who keeps them in the dark. The door clicked open. A faint breeze rolled in. Cold. Real. Alive. The creatures stopped. The air hit their faces like a memory returning. One stepped forward, slowly onto the concrete yard. The sky above was still dim, early morning gray, but to them it must have felt like a miracle. Another stepped out. And another. Raymond followed them into the yard. They all looked upward as the first hint of sunlight broke through the clouds, a thin, warm beam cutting across the sky. The creatures stretched their arms toward it, fingers trembling, faces lifting. Skins glowing pale gold for the first time in decades. Daniels felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't a breakout. It was a return to life. As the sun warmed their skin, the creatures collapsed, not from weakness, but from relief. Raymond knelt beside them. Whispered, you're free. Daniels, Riley, and Hart stood in the yard, not knowing what would come next. Medical teams would arrive. Reports would be written. Investigations would explode. But for this moment, the secrets buried under Pelican Bay were finally out, and the ghosts in the walls had finally seen the sun.